What's up everybody, Mallow here, back with another EDH tech video, and today we're making a Goblin deck. And I know, before you say, yawn, everybody makes a Goblin deck, Mallow, this one's going to be a little bit unconventional, because this time we're using Wort the Raidmother. Now I made this deck live on stream, and the first version of the deck didn't quite sit well with me. So, after some soul searching at the top of a mountain, I came back the next day live on stream, and we made it better. And that's the version you're going to see today. By the way, if you like deck building and you've got some opinions about the decks that we make on this channel, you can actually come and give your 2 cents to me live at twitch.tv/themallowman. I take chat's input every time we make one of these decks, and I'd love to hear from you. By the way, if you like the content that we make on this channel and you want to see more of it, don't forget to like, subscribe, ring that notification bell so you don't miss a video. I'll see you in the next video. Be good to yourselves, be good to each other, and most importantly, stay weird. The balance of this deck is really meant to put an emphasis both on creatures and the spells, with a few artifacts and enchantments in there to enhance both. The creatures are there really to kind of buff and give you some blocking, set up a wall, maybe be aggressive with some of the attacks if you need to, but it's a bit more balanced than just we're slinging spells all over the place. Now, for this to continue to be a Goblin tribal deck, there are 2 main things that I wanted to keep track of here. 1, most of the creatures in this deck need to be goblins, with a few allies there just to kind of help build out and round out your creature base. And then 2, you want to have a lot of instants and sorcery spells available to you, which is very different than most Goblin tribal decks that are led by things like Krinko. This deck is built around Wort the Raidmother, a 3/3 Goblin Shaman for 5 mana that debuted originally in the Shadowmoor days. When Wort the Raidmother comes into play, it gives you 2 1/1 red and green Goblin Warrior tokens, and then puts them into play. That's important because now each red and green instant or sorcery spell that you have has Conspire, which means you can tap those 2 tokens and make a copy of that spell and put it to new targets, which could be yourself, could be many other things. Now, a lot of things about a Goblin deck is built around getting out creatures really quickly. One of the supporting characters and casts in this is Krinko Mob Boss, that allows you to put out even more creatures. And it's important because you're going to need these creatures because you can keep casting Conspire all day long. It doesn't say that you can only do it 1 time, which means the more creatures you have out there, the more times you can Conspire, which means the more creatures that can come out, and suddenly you're overrun with goblins. So Krinko is a 3/3 for 4 mana. When you tap it, you create X 1/1 red goblin creature tokens, where X is the number of goblins you control. So the more goblins that come out onto the field, the more that you can put into battle. It's also supported by a Planeswalker, which is something I haven't seen in a lot of other decks. Xenagos the Reveler is a legendary Planeswalker. Its loyalty counters allow you to add X mana in any combination of red or green, which will be important for later on because you're going to want to do some mana battery kind of things. Using a Planeswalker as a mana battery is a little bit unconventional. That's okay. Its 0 loyalty counter, though, is you create a 2/2 red and green satyr creature token with haste. And that's also going to be important again for Conspire. Some other support cards that you're going to see throughout the deck. 1 is the Circle of Dreams Druid that allows you to add green mana for each creature that you control. That's going to be important when we take a look at all the spells and instants that we're going to play. But it's also important just to get more creatures out on the board. The more mana that you have, the better. Things like Boartusk Liege, which will give red and green creatures +1/+1 for each of their colors, is also important because goblins are naturally a little bit more flimsy and a little bit more fragile. So giving them a little bit of buff the best you can is good. Things like Charmbreaker Devils, though, as another sort of goblin ally. At the beginning of your upkeep, you return an instant or sorcery card at random from your graveyard to your hand. So this creates a cycle between the sorceries and instants that you are already casting to deal damage, and you bring them back into your hand. They're also a 4/4, and when you cast an instant or sorcery spell, they get +4/+0 until end of turn. Some of our classics that we really want to see to keep this wall up and to keep our goblins buffed. Goblin Chieftain, Goblin King, Goblin War Chief, all giving things that allow your cast goblin spells for cheaper and to buff goblins throughout the whole piece. Goblin Matron, something that came all the way back from Urza's Saga. It allows you to go and find one of your token generation goblins, something like a Krinko. Our last couple of allies are Ruby, the Daring Tracker, which is another mana battery. It gives us red or green mana. It also gives us, if we get our goblins up to a power of 4 or more, it gets +2/+2 until end of turn when it attacks. So if you want to be a little bit more aggressive, especially in the early game, it is possible to do that for a cheap mana cost. Our young Pyromancer is also very important. It's going to deal and give us elemental creatures, which actually works with Caterwauling Boggart. That allows our elemental creatures basically to have menace. It also gives goblin creatures menace. So there's a little bit of coherency and a little bit of working together with those two. Our final ally is Zarta Druid. It's another mana battery for cheap, but when you tap it for mana, it deals damage to each opponent. Remember, one of the things that we love to do, especially with EDH decks, is deal damage to all opponents. So you don't necessarily get everybody mad at you the whole time, but you know, plinking for a little bit of 1-2 damage here and there isn't bad, and it also kind of keeps the playing field a little bit more level, and it allows you a little bit more survivability, especially if you're playing against like a dragon deck, an elf deck, other tribals that are going to bring out big heavy creatures throughout the game. Taking a look at our artifacts, it's all pretty straightforward. We're looking for mana batteries and we're looking for buffs. So we're looking for the Gruul Cluestone. Say that 5 times fast. You're looking at Soul Ring, which is kind of one of those auto-includes for every one of these types of decks. You're looking at Vanquisher's Banner. You're going to choose Goblin as the type. You get +1/+1. It's another way to make Goblins a little bit more resilient and keep them out on the board to give you blocks or to do some attacks if you've got board wipe. Finally, there's Throne of the God Pharaoh, which at the beginning of your end step, each opponent loses life to the number of tapped creatures you control. And if you're tapping a lot of these creatures for Conspire for every time that you cast a instant or sorcery spell, that's a lot of extra damage that you're doing to each opponent. Again, we like to spread out the damage, we like to spread out the love, and the more that we can do that, the better. Let's look at our enchantments. Right now, we've got my favorite one to run with any goblin deck, Boggart's Shenanigans. Whenever another goblin you control is put into the graveyard from the battlefield, you may have it deal 1 damage to target player. That means even if there's a bunch of board wipe, you're still dealing damage. So for instance, if you have to sack a bunch of creatures, and even the creature tokens count, so if you have to sack a bunch of creature tokens for something that comes along, that still deals extra damage to a target player. So you can sack it for, say, Goblin Bombardment, which allows you to sacrifice a creature and deal 1 damage to any target. Now you can split those two off if you want to, or now you're dealing 2 damage to a target player or to a target creature for every goblin token that you sacrifice on the board. Doubling Season is another one that we want to have with Conspire. So every time that you're popping the Mob Boss or the 10 Street Kingpin, you are making double the amount of tokens that you normally would create. And then also, if an effect would put 1 or more counters on a permanent you control, it puts twice as many of those counters on it as you go, which when paired with Grimgully the Generous, each non-human creature you control enters the battlefield with an additional +1/+1 counter on it. Now you're getting everything with a +2/+2 counter on it, and you're still getting a bit of that balance and resiliency that you need to work from there. There's multiple combos like this throughout the deck. Fiery Emancipation is kind of an auto-include in any red deck for me. It's an enchantment. It says if a source you control would deal damage to a permanent or player, it deals triple that damage to that permanent or player instead. So now, every time you sack a creature, every time you attack, every time you cast Conspire, you're dealing 3x damage to anything from any source on the board. Impact Tremors, every time one of those tokens hits the ground, it deals damage to each opponent. This is the loop that we start to create with this deck. Parallel Lives, it's an expensive card, but it's an important card for a deck like this. If an effect would create 1 or more tokens under your control, it creates twice that many as well. In a deck that is built around creating tokens to tap to cast Conspire, or to just be able to overrun your opponent, this is a huge card to be able to play. Finally, in enchantments, there's Virtue of Strength, and that basically tells us if you tap a basic land for mana, it produces 3 times as much of that mana instead. That will be important when we look at our sorceries, but it's also important too that its secondary ability, Gardening Growth, is return target creature or land card from your graveyard to your hand. And for only 1 green mana, that's important, because anybody who understands Krinko the 10 Street King or the mob boss, or even looking at some of like your Goblin Kings and things like that, they're going to want to take those out as quickly as possible. So the ability to bring one back for 1 mana is huge and can't be understated in a deck like this. Okay, finally, we get to the big stars of this show, and that's the sorceries and the instants that you're going to conspire and basically wipe the floor with your opponents. I take a lot of purpose in looking at X mana cards, and the X mana cards are very important because when you think about something like Xenagos the Reveler, where you add X mana in any combination of red or green, where X is the number of creatures you control, that's going to get you a lot of mana really, really quick for +1 loyalty counter. So what you want to do is pair that up with spells like Banefire, Devil's Play, Fanning the Flames, everybody's favorite, oldie but a goodie, Fireball. And there's even some in green for Hurricane, which deals X damage to each player and each creature with flying. Finally, there's spells like Karvek's Torch, Molten Disaster, Reap the Past, and Rolling Thunder that all deal damage based on how much mana you can pump into it. This is going to be huge as you start having a lot of mana batteries out on the floor, and you can start doing Conspire. So you cast this, you tap some of your tokens, you've got Conspire, you tap more tokens, you've got Conspire again, and you start laying waste to creatures, to players, to whatever you want to kind of look at. To help you get more land on the board, you've got some very classics like Cultivate and Harvest Season that allows you to search your library for up to X basic land cards, where X is the number of tapped creatures you control, and you put those onto the battlefield tapped and you shuffle your library. Restock is another one of those things where if we need to go get cards back at a certain point in time, especially those creatures that are helping us create more tokens, it's an expensive card, but again, we're going to have a lot of mana out on the field. It gives us a chance to bring that back and put it in there. Unfortunately, you have to exile it at the end of using it, which means it doesn't create this loop of being able to come back into your hand, but that's okay. And that's it. That's the whole deck. You've got a balance of creatures, you've got a lot of sorceries and instants, you have easy ways to get mana out onto the field. And so you've got a lot of goblins. You can take it as a frontal assault with goblins, or you can use them as a wall and lob artillery at your opponents all day long. Thank you for joining me. We'll see you in the next video.